Hello, I am back after quite a break, but not in the garden. And I'm in a small area. It's about half to a third the size of a single garage. And I'm hoping eventually to turn this into a little workshop. So this video will be in here doing something quite different. So you may have noticed on previous videos that I've got a little bit of a thing for Japanese tools. It started with a really nice pair of hand-forged Japanese secateurs. They are an absolute delight. The steel's fantastic, the craftsmanship is amazing, and they are wonderful to use. There's no gimmicks, there's no plastic, there's no silly little knobs and widgets. They're kind of minimalist, but there's nothing about it that you would change in order to improve its function or indeed its look. They are elegant and delightful, as indeed are a great many Japanese tools. And so my wife would say it's an obsession. She might be right. Let's say enthusiasm for them then developed with loppers and pruning saws and a really nice hand-forged gardening trowel and hose and so on. And eventually, of course, it moved into the workshop where I'm enjoying the use of Japanese saws and chisels and these things. So this is a Japanese kanna plane. I mean, it's a wood plane, and this looks at first glance to be just about as simple a wooden plane as you could get. I mean, it's a brick-shaped lump of wood with a chunk of steel wedged into it. It doesn't get much easier than that. And it also bears a rather superficial resemblance to a Western wooden-bodied plane. That was very common before the metal-bodied planes took over. However, there are some quite significant differences between the two. But in any event, this is a tool intended for planing wood. And yeah, of course, I could use a Western-style metal plane. They've got lots of advantages. I'll talk a little bit more about those later, but I rather like the Japanese tools. I like their simplicity and their elegance, and they are really nice to use. Now, there are a couple of issues with these. Although they look very simple, in fact, that apparent simplicity is a mirage. They are, in fact, a little bit tricky to set up if you've never done it before. And I've set up a few of these now, planes and a spoke shave, and so I've gone through that process a few times, and I've got these working to some degree, and there's quite a bit to know in order to set one of these up, and there is undoubtedly a huge amount still that I could learn about these, because although they are apparently quite simple looking, setting them up for perfect planing, it involves quite a lot of subtle little points. And I've got a new one here that has never been set up. This is as it arrived from Japan, and this is slightly weird if you're used to sort of Western style tools. We have an expectation that you open the box, you pick up the tool, and you can just crack on and use it straight away. These, and lots of Japanese tools actually, they do not come ready to use straight from the box. Lots of tools, chisels and planes in particular, but also certain knives and other bladed implements, they all need a fair bit of work to get them going, and it's an interesting difference in philosophy. So the idea is that I think the blacksmith has done his job. This wooden block has been carved to some degree, but the final fit of the blade in the block and the final shaping of the block is left to the individual craftsman to set up how they would like to do it. And different craftsmen undoubtedly want to get slightly different things out of their tools. So that is how you get it. With Japanese chisels, when you get those, the hoops on the end won't have been set typically. You need to flatten the backs and hone the blades and so on. So a lot of these tools, they're not ready to go straight away. And setting one of these up so that it will cut effectively is not as straightforward as you might imagine. So what I thought I'd do is a little set of videos that go through the process. Effectively, we've got three things to do here to get this right. We've got the blade and the chip breaker here, these metal components. We've got to prepare those. That involves flattening the backs, maybe some other modifications to the blade, getting the chip breaker to sit properly. When the blade is prepared, the second step is to fit the blade to the block here. This is called the die, and it's partially fitted, but it doesn't go all the way in, where I would guess we're at least 10 mil short of the mouth here. So we've got a bit of work to get this to fit properly into the body of the plane. And then the third job is to prepare the sole, and how you set that up depends exactly how you're going to use the plane. So there's quite a lot to do, and there are some interesting and subtle points regarding I won't say the best way to do it, or just a way to do it. And of course, there are many folk out there that know a lot more about these than I do, but I thought I might be able to add a interesting and fun little video showing how to set these up. What I'll probably do is upload those as three separate parts, dealing with those three tasks. And in this video, maybe I'll talk a little bit about what we have here and some of the issues, the anatomy of the Japanese wooden plane, and yeah, introduce you to some of the points and where it differs from a Western version. Now, of course, if you're looking at a metal-bodied Western plane, these are worlds apart. These can be set up to perform exactly the same functions as a Western plane, and because the steel is of particularly good quality, potentially, if you get a decent one, then when it's set up properly, these can cut very nicely indeed. So there's nothing you can't do with one of these that you can easily do with a Western style metal bodied plane. They do, of course, have much more in common with the old fashioned wooden bodied planes, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. If you happen to have some, maybe you've got inherited them from a parent or a grandparent, they are still wonderful tools and can be made to do a fine job. But your metal bodied plane, it does admittedly have some benefits. The sole of the plane probably needs to be flattened, but once you've flattened it, it's then going to remain flat. This is not true of a wooden bodied plane, whether it's a Japanese plane or a Western style. The body will need occasional truing and refinement in order to get this to cut well and to produce nice flat wood. Other advantages, of course, of the Western plane are that it's rather simple to adjust. You've probably got a lateral adjustment lever, and you've got a little knob there for winding the blade in and out. And depending what sort of plane it is, you've probably got some means of adjusting the throat here, widening this for larger cuts, closing it down for fine shavings. All of that is rather straightforward with a Western plane. That is not to say that the Western planes are perfect, because they're not. There are an enormous number of them that are absolutely dreadful. But if you've got a decent one, either you've got a new or newish plane from one of the premium brands, or then you've got your hands on, say, an old Stanley plane that you've restored. Those are going to last a lifetime, and they're going to perform very well indeed, and they're nice and simple. If you've got yourself a bunch of those, there's no obvious reason why you'd rush out to buy a Japanese plane, but these are very nice and I really like them. They appeal to me in the same way that a lot of the Japanese tools appeal to me. They are, at least in outward appearance, quite simple, but they are elegant and sophisticated tools if you know how to set them up and use them properly. Well, I know a little bit of that, and that's what I hope to share. So looking at the features of this plane, the first thing, this is not fitted tightly at the moment. The first thing to notice, well, we've got a plain blade, and we've got a chip breaker. Now, the chip breaker itself is kind of a separate part. Some of the kanna have the chip breaker and some of them don't. If you see a pin in the body like that there, that's intended for holding the chip breaker. And here we have the first difference between a typical Western plane and the Japanese plane. Even a wooden bodied Western style plane, the blade is comparatively thin, and it's typically held in place with a wedge. So on the body of the plane, there is a groove on each side, and the blade slides down that groove. Now, in the Western style plane, this groove will be very much deeper, and then there will be a wooden wedge that holds the blade in place. Now, the Japanese blade is already wedge shaped, so we don't need that extra wedge, and it's held in place simply by dropping it into the body and tapping it in. And that is the means of adjusting a kanna plane. It's with a hammer or a mallet, and you tap the blade to advance it. You can adjust it laterally with a tap on the side, and then to remove the blade, you tap on the body of the plane. Now, it's quite important. At this point, you can mess up your kanna die and split it. And if you browse around eBay, you'll find plenty of old kanna with splits running down the body. So you should never whack this straight on the ends. You want to hit this on this edge here. Now, later on, this will be chamfered. This die, because it hasn't been prepared yet, it's still got crisp edges on here, and it's normal for these to have a small chamfer, maybe a larger chamfer at the back, because this is where we are going to have to tap the body to free the blade. So once we've wedged this in place, it's quite firm. You can't just give it a tug. So you want to tap that with a mallet or a hammer, and you want to be more or less in line with the plain blade. And then a little bit of physics, you're tapping the body. This is going to free up this blade. And you don't want to hit in the middle of the die, because that is potentially how you can split these. You need to hit on either side, alternating. And now my blade is free once again. Now, that pin has nothing to do with the blade. So this blade will go into the body, it will be wedged in place, and it will be happy to stay there without the use of the chip breaker. And some planes don't have a chip breaker. Whether you want one or not, it depends what you're doing with it. It's entirely up to you. Some planes have it, many of them now have it. Smoothing planes in particular, they tend to have the chip breaker, but there are lots of them that don't, and you can decide whether or not you want to use it. Now, the chip breaker, that's another slab of metal. It's slightly dished. It has little ears on the end, these little tabs have been bent over, and that separates it from the blade itself, and then that becomes wedged between the blade and this pin. So that pin is important for holding this chip breaker in place, and in order to get that fit just right, you may have to adjust the pin, and you may have to adjust the ears on the chip breaker. So that's all part of preparing the metal work, if you like, for first use. You don't have to worry about it afterwards. Afterwards, all you're going to be doing is honing the edges. So if I return to the blade, apart from being thick and heavy and wedge shaped this way, there's something else that is, I was going to say unique to the Japanese blades. It's not unique to the Japanese blades, but it's very common on Japanese blades and rather uncommon on any Western blade. So this is made out of two pieces of metal. It's not one uniform piece of steel. This has, for the cutting edge, it has a piece of very hard steel, and this is it here. It's not the entire length of the blade. That you couldn't use all of this blade. Some of that's needed to wedge into the body. So the hard cutting steel stops on this plane. It stops here, and that's quite typical. And this is the portion that you can use. It varies in thickness, but it is a thin layer relative to the size of the thickness of the blade as a whole. And then the rest of this is a chunk of iron or low carbon steel. Usually it's some sort of soft iron. That's ideal. Now, typically with a Western blade, whether it's a plain blade or a chisel, you've got some material that is uniform. It's one piece of steel. Now, it's always a compromise between different properties of the cutting tool. You want a fine-grained steel, and Japanese steels are fantastic for that. They're really great. They're nice, fine-grained steel. They can be honed to a very sharp edge, and obviously you want it to be hard, because if it's not hard, as soon as you've cut a couple of strokes, the blade is blunt and you need to resharpen it. So hardness is great, and these blades are really quite hard. However, they would be far too brittle to use on their own. And so the compromise with a Japanese blade is that they laminate this hard steel onto this soft iron or softer steel backing, and that way you get the hardness, the edge retention of this tough bit of steel, but you get the ductility of this softer backing, so that hopefully we don't have problems with cracking, and we don't want to see too much chipping either, but sometimes that's a little bit hard to avoid. There is no one perfect steel. If you're making it harder, you're making it more brittle. So with the Japanese blades, the compromise is achieved by lamination. On the Western blade, you've got a consistent material, and therefore those blades, they're not hardened quite as much as these. So we're going to get a harder blade here because of the lamination. On the Western style, if you harden it too much, it's going to be brittle. It's liable to break. So it's a different way of achieving that compromise between the ductility, that you don't want it too brittle, versus you want a nice piece of steel that's hard enough to keep its edge for a while. So there are all sorts of other properties of sort of abrasion resistance and so on. And there are, as you might imagine, many different sorts of steel that are used in these blades. The most common steels to find for Japanese blades for chisels and planes are known as white paper and blue paper steel. Very often white paper steel for a chisel and blue for a plane blade, but there are many other sorts, and it is worth looking at the different properties of the steels that are available and matching those to the work that you're doing. And this is one area where I think there's a lot more variability in the Japanese blades. So it depends whether you're using, primarily whether you're using lots of softwoods or moderately hardwoods or then exotic timbers. You would potentially choose a different steel for those tasks. Perhaps the most common is some sort of blue paper steel, and this is a blue paper steel blade. I think in fact all of my kanna are some sort of blue paper steel. I've got one that is blue super. I'm not entirely certain what that is, whether it's number 1 or 2, but it's one of those steels, and it is worth thinking a little bit. I mean, if in doubt, a blue paper steel blade is probably going to be quite suitable for general woodworking purposes. A white paper steel is probably, it's a little bit easier to sharpen. You may even get a slightly keener edge, but this blade should have a little bit better abrasion resistance. It should keep that edge for a little bit longer and potentially is a little bit better on some of the harder woods. The blue super blade that I have, that should be much better on harder timbers. So that is quite a different sort of beast from a Western blade. The other feature of these blades is that, and this is also the case with chisels, is that they typically have a hollow ground back. So the only bit of the blade that's flat across here is around the outside, and this is just slightly dished. It's ground that way for one very important reason. This stuff is really hard, and in order to sharpen a blade, you have to have two planes coming together in a point. If either of those planes is not flat, you're not going to have a sharp edge. So you need to be able to flatten the back of this blade. And that is true for any blade that you want to sharpen. Any single bevel blade, planes, chisels, certain knives, you need to be able to flatten this back, and that is the key to getting a sharp blade. If it's not flat on the back, it doesn't matter what you do on this edge, you're not going to get that sharp. So we need to be able to flatten this, but we do not want to have to abrade a large area of this rock hard material. So the only area we really need to worry about is the small land right across the front. And with a bit of luck, when I lap the back of this blade later, I hope to see that this is nice and flat across here. If it's not, then I'm going to have to address that before I move on to honing this edge. Another area where they often differ is that the Japanese blades, they don't often have a micro bevel. So it's quite common with Western plane blades and chisel blades that you'll grind a certain angle across most of the blade, let's say 25 degrees, and then you'll add maybe a 5-degree micro bevel just at the end, and that will then make that, let's say, roughly a 30-degree angle, just for example, and that's going to be that little bit more robust at the very edge than a 25-degree blade. I mean, the shallower that angle, the less support there is behind the edge, and the more likely it is that that edge is going to get damaged when you start to use it. So micro bevels are very common on the Western tools, but not so common on these, and you, I don't think you want to do it. So I mean, you could, it would be a pretty small bevel because you're only dealing with a small amount of hard steel there. It's not that thick. But you could do it, but I think generally they're very often just sharpened at whatever angle you want, and you might want to change that angle depending on what sort of work it's doing. The shallower angles being rather better suited to softwoods than hardwoods. What else? Now, a plane serves three main purposes, I suppose. I haven't really thought this through, but I'm off the top of my head. The first thing it needs to do is remove material. So if we've got something that's obviously bigger than we want it to be, we've got to get rid of material. And then there are two very important functions. We want to be able to flatten a piece of material to some degree. Now, this is not high precision engineering. So, you know, we're going to be working with wood, so there will be a reasonable tolerance, but we want to be able to flatten a piece of material, a board. Maybe we're preparing edges for jointing, or it doesn't matter what we're doing. We need to be able to flatten, and we need to be able to smooth. We need to be able to prepare a surface either for taking finish or then get it to the point where quicksand will make it suitable for whatever finish you're putting on it. So that plane has to do those three jobs: remove material, and sometimes large amounts of it, and especially if you're not using power tools, if you don't have a mechanical planer, thicknesser, jointer, whatever, a bandsaw or anything else. If you're working with hand tools and you've got a saw and a plane, you're going to need a plane that can hog off some pretty thick amounts of wood. So what you're going to use the plane for will affect how you set it up. And it will do that in a couple of ways. One is with the blade. So, I mean, this is common with any plane. I mean, if you have a perfectly square blade and you take a deep cut, you can end up with tram lines. The edges of the cut, they don't blend with the surrounding wood, and you leave little ridges everywhere. So it's very common to have just a slight camber to feather the edges of the blade out just a little bit each side, so that you're taking more of a scoop than a sort of a rectangular section of wood away. And that's really going to help get rid of those tram lines. So you definitely want a tiny amount of that on the blade. Now, if you're going to set up a plane for getting rid of a lot of material, so effectively Japanese equivalent of a scrub plane, you can put a lot of camber on the blade. It's quite a bit of work if it's not already set up for it, because you've got to work away at that hard material. But there's no reason why you can't put a pretty substantial curve on one of these blades and set up a plane for taking off large amounts of material. The other thing you'll need to do, of course, is adjust the mouth of the plane to suit. So you need to widen that. If you're taking large cuts, you want to keep it fairly tight. If you're trying to take thin slivers. Now, as for the other two functions of the plane, truing a board or an edge, or smoothing it, what happens with these is that the sole of the plane is conditioned differently for those two tasks. Now, obviously we've got to flatten the sole of this plane as you would with any plane before first use, and because this is wood, periodically when you need to check that it's still suitably aligned and re-flatten it from time to time. But something that's quite unique with these Japanese planes are that they are set up with only small areas that are intended to be in contact with the wood that you're working. So if you're setting this up as a smoothing plane, they are typically set up, let me just pop the blade back in so it's obvious where I'm talking about. Now these are pulled in this direction. Obviously the blade is here. Well, you could push it if you like, but they're kind of, the ergonomics of it, they're expected to be pulled. So we're moving this way. These are typically set up for smoothing so that this only touches the wood underneath in two small areas. One strip here and one strip just in front of the blade where the blade comes through. And the area in between, that is relieved somewhat so that it's not touching the timber underneath. Helps the plane glide along. You're only really worried about getting these two contact points correct. Now that sets the effective length of the plane, and that's for smoothing, and there's no contact after the blade on a typical smoothing plane. Now if you want to set a plane up for truing, then you might want a third contact point at the end of the body, and that then gives effectively a longer bodied plane. Now you don't tend to get really long bodied planes like this. They would be a bit of a nightmare to maintain, but there are some that are, let's say they're around 400 long, something like that, but they're not quite as long as the longest of the Western planes. So there's work to do on this sole to set it up according to the sort of work that you want to do. You've got to set that mouth up according to the sort of depth of cut you want to take, and then you've got to condition this sole so that you've got the contact points where you want them, whether you're using 3 points or 2. And the area between those, well, we've got to remove some material. It doesn't matter how you do that. You can do it with sandpaper. You can use a scraper, which is what I will probably do. And there are, in fact, specific planes that are intended for planing the sole. And apart from that, of course, we got to flatten it so that those contact points are coplanar, or nothing's going to work quite right with one of these. So that's pretty much the anatomy of the plane. I'm sorry, that's a really long video, but that's the anatomy of a Japanese kanna plane and some of the points that you have to look at if you come across one of these and want to give it a go. They really are lovely things, and they work really very well. They're a pleasure to use. You're sort of in, I don't know, you're in quite close contact with the wood. There are no gadgets. There's no knobs and levers and bells and whistles here. This is all about the quality, the craftsmanship of that steel, and how this die has been set up that's going to let you work that wood the way you want to do it. And there's something really, for me, there's something really pleasant about that. I am, of course, a little bit odd, in the same way I like lots of old varieties in the garden. I quite like old-fashioned tools, and this is a delight. Now, before I end this video, let's just have a look at a couple of cheap ones in action. This is they're all laminated blades, blue paper steel. They're not bad, but they're not particularly expensive. In fact, this one's not particularly expensive either, but I'd say this is another tier above these others. Now, the bodies themselves, they're made out of Japanese oak. It's a kind of oak, but it's really quite different, I think, from European or American oaks. They're evergreen trees. They've got some useful properties, and the white and the red oak are very commonly used for tools and handles. Chisel handles, very often red oak. The plain bodies will be red or white oak, and they're really nice materials. But they're cut in a particular way, and there's a lot of subtlety in choosing a piece of wood and shaping it for a kanna, and the way the grain is running. depends what you want to do with it, which grain orientation is ideal. You might imagine that you'd want to pick a quarter sawn piece of timber for it, but that's not really the case. You've got pros and cons depending which way the grain is cut, and all of that stuff is endlessly fascinating, but does make this a surprisingly complicated and sophisticated tool when really at first glance it's just a brick of wood and a chunk of metal. It's an amazing thing. So let's just have a quick look. You might have a number of different planes for different tasks, with Western planes as well as with the kanna. The Western plane's a little bit more versatile, of course, because it's very much easier to keep fiddling around with the depth of cut, and it's not something you want to be doing all the time with these. But I've got these three set slightly differently. So this one is taking a fairly bold cut, quite thick shavings off of that. There's some I did earlier. It's quite a thick chunk, and you can take deeper, of course. And then I've got progressively lighter cuts on these. It's quite a nice thin shaving. Now this blade is actually a little narrower at the cutting point than this piece of timber, and of course I've cambered this blade so it's not cutting the full width of this timber. But the important thing is it's not leaving any tram lines. In fact, it's leaving a beautiful surface and moderately thin lines. And this one is just set up as just a little smoothing plane. So it's relieved at the back. I think on those I've got 3 contact points. This one is set up with just 2 contact points there, and just for smoothing or just dimensioning small pieces of timber, and that is set up to produce just the finest wispy little shavings wherever it finds a high spot. And the surface that's left, well, you wouldn't want to sand it. It's glossy and so smooth, it's delightful. Well, one feature is certainly in common with my gardening videos. That was a big pile of waffle. Now, in the next 3, I will go through setting up this new plane for first use. So to start with, I'll deal with the ironmongery, flattening the back of the blade, and I'll talk about what to do if the blade is not flat, if it's substantially out of flat. Because you don't necessarily want to sit there grinding away at that blade and removing that hollow grind. There are other ways of dealing with that. I have to find out if I need to be engaging with any of those alternative methods when I start to lap the back of that blade. I'll prepare the chip breaker. Now sometimes the chip breaker isn't laminated, but on any reasonable quality plane, and certainly on a good plane, the chip breaker is going to be laminated in a very similar way to the actual blade itself, and this one of course is laminated, but that needs to be adjusted so that it fits properly. So that'll be the first video. In the second one, I will get that blade fitted into the die because it's a long way out at the moment. And then finally, I will sort out the sole of this die and get those 2 contact points, relieve this area. Now, I said earlier on that a lot of the work is in tuning a kanna is left to the individual craftsman. With this die, this portion has in fact already been relieved. I'm feeling it. I can feel where a cutter has been there. I suspect this was just passed over a planing blade and a machine rather than by hand, judging by the feel of that. But in any event, this has been relieved here already. So if I wanted to set this up with 3 points, I would have to either plane or sand back quite a lot of material here, and I could do it. And it's better to do that, some of that work before fitting the blade, if you're going to have to remove much material, because when you're fitting the blade, we're going to get that so that it's coming out with just a few taps of the hammer will position it at just the right depth there. So I wouldn't want to do that and then come along and take, I think this gap here is quite big. If I put a straight edge on that, hold it up to the light, I mean I think it's about 0.4 of a millimetre. So if I wanted to set this up for truing rather than smoothing, I would take this material off first before I finish that blade. Now, you do want to have the blade fitted, not sticking out, but in the body when you do the final flattening of the die, because when you wedge that blade in, the stress is involved in holding that blade in place. It can cause the wood to move a little bit, and you don't want to tune the body without the blade in, stick the blade in, then find that the body is not quite as it should be. We want to make sure that that blade is fitted pretty close before we come back and do the final finishing of the sole. But anyway, that will be the final video, and hopefully at the end of that I have got a very nice new Japanese kanna plane. Anyway, what do I normally say? It's been so long since I've done a video. It is nice to be back. Thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.